I remember in 2004 going over to cover the 60th anniversary of D-Day. And at the time, the United States was obviously in the Iraq War. And there had been protests against the United States, involvement there in France and Germany, across Europe, and an open hostility toward American leadership. And I didn't know what to expect when I went over there. And after we landed and got up to Normandy on June the 5th, the night before the anniversary, I was walking around with veterans who were met in the streets of Normandy by young children with flowers, with their parents right behind them. And they would hand the flowers to the veterans, and with American flags flying from every house. And they would say, I want to thank you. My parents have told me that we would not be free today if it weren't for what you did. And the vets would be breaking down crying. The parents would be breaking down crying. It's just extraordinary. It's something that we need to stop every June the 6th. And remember, I took my kids last year when we covered it again for this network. And it was one of the most moving things. Well, it was the most moving thing that I've been honored to be able to do since working here. I want to show you a clip of a prayer that was delivered by FDR ahead of D-Day, which of course was June 6th, 1944, 76 years ago tomorrow, as depicted in the award-winning short documentary Operation Overlord, OSS, and the Battle for France.
With thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil.
Let's bring in now retired four-star Admiral William McRaven. And Admiral, the thing that struck me as I was talking to these older veterans were they were just kids. They were 18, 19, 20, some of them 17. Some of them lied to the draft board so they could participate in the liberation of Europe. What are your thoughts this morning as we're a day away from the 76th anniversary? And talk about the OSS's part in this extraordinary operation.
Yeah, well, Joe, first, thanks for having me on. As you know, we scheduled this a couple of weeks ago before all the turmoil and the tragedy of the last week and a half. And but I think it is important that we remember these kind of solemn moments in American history. And when you think of D-Day, 150,000 soldiers, over 190,000 sailors that participated in the largest amphibious operation in history of warfare, getting a foothold in France and then moving on to defeat the Nazis. And to your point, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, really played a key role. The OSS was the forerunners of today's CIA and Special Operations, headed by General Bill Donovan, who both the CIA and U.S. Special Operations consider kind of the father of the organization. But those remarkable men and women in the OSS fought behind the lines to delay the German advance. They blew up bridges and trains and warehouses, all in an effort to delay the German response to Normandy. And, of course, they had been part of the war effort for years leading up to it. Over 500 OSS operatives and Special Operations executive operatives from our British colleagues were part of that mission to delay and stop and be an integral part of the D-Day landing.
Speaking of British colleagues, Caddy Kay is with us and has a question for you. Caddy.
So, Admiral, I guess D-Day stands out as a moment when the world really, worked together in incredible coordination and bravery under the American leadership. But let's bring us to this day where I fear that's crumbling. And I walked down to the White House the other night and walked past military vehicles on the streets of Washington and saw the military police outside the White House and troops on the corners of this capital city. And I thought, there's been so much attention. Reverend Al referred to it yesterday at the memorial service. There's been a lot of attention around the world to these protests. Many of it we've seen protesters in support in Paris and Berlin and London. Much of it's been supportive. But I was concerned seeing those troops, American troops, used against the American people, or poised to, that other autocratic leaders in other countries might look at that as cover for themselves. America's still a great power, and what it does here, for better and worse, can be implicated. And I was concerned that you might have other countries look at America right now and say, in countries where there are despots, and say, okay, well, the White House can do this, we can do this too. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I absolutely think that's a valid concern, and I was very pleased to see Jim Mattis and obviously Admiral Mike Mullen, today John Kelly, come out and reinforce what we know to be the principles of the U.S. military. Is we all raise our right hand and we swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. It is not to the President of the United States; it is to the Constitution. And again, I have been pleased with the voices that have been raised against the potential for the Insurrection Act, and to recognize that we are all Americans. And Reverend Al, I thought, said it beautifully when he talked about hope and us all coming together around the same table. Trust me, every man and woman in uniform recognizes that we are all Americans, and that the last thing they want to do as military men and women is to stand in the way of a peaceful protest. And again, great to see the voices being raised, and a little bit of hopefully sanity coming back to this very, very tragic situation.
Admiral McRaven, it's Willie Geist. Always great to see you. I want to ask you more about D-Day in just a moment, but General Mattis, in the memo he wrote, said it was an abuse of executive authority to clear that square and to put some members of the National Guard in the street and use them the way the president did. Do you agree with the general's assessment?
Well, I don't know whether I'd have to go back and check the legal application of abuse of executive authority. But what I can tell you is, when you're in the military, there are 3 criteria for every decision we make. It has to be moral, legal, and ethical. Ethical, you have to follow the rules. Legal, you have to follow the law. And then moral, you have to follow what you know to be right. And either way, that's just not right. You're not going to use, whether it's a military or the National Guard or law enforcement, to clear peaceful American citizens for the President of the United States to do a photo op. There is nothing, morally right about that.
So, Admiral, getting back to D-Day and the OSS, I, too, as Joe talked about, I don't think I've had chills stronger ever in my life than when I've stood on Omaha Beach and just looked out at that water when I visited there about 25 years ago, looking out and thinking about the sacrifice that those young Americans and those young Canadians and Australians and Brits made together on that beach. But you're struck as you study it, this size and the scope of this mission, and the fact that they were able to keep it under wraps for so long from the Germans. Can you speak a little bit to how that was carried out when you look at the sheer number of vehicles and the number of ships that made that trip across the water to land on those beaches? How were they able to keep it under wraps and to keep it a surprise to Hitler?
Well, I think, as you know, there were 2 potential landing spots. There was Calais, and then, of course, there was Normandy. Right. So there was a tremendous amount of effort that went into operational deception, so that the Germans never really knew exactly where the U.S., Canadian, and British forces were going to land. Having said that, of course, the Germans still had pretty strong defenses along the 10-mile stretch of land that was Normandy and the 5 landing beaches. The casualties at Omaha alone were, in the thousands, 50% casualties in terms of, men lost and wounded and missing in action. So this was a huge part of the plan, was the operational deception, and obviously it worked as well as it could under the circumstances. I mean, you're talking about a very short channel crossing. The Germans clearly knew when the Allied forces had launched but it was too late by that time to reinforce Normandy. So again, great operational security.
Admiral David Ignatius is with us and has a question for you. David.
Admiral McRaven, I did want to ask, you've watched the events of the last few years as carefully as anyone, and our military, its professionalism have been under some attack, and I would greatly value, and know our viewers would, your assessment of whether there's been damage, whether there's some repair that needs to be done now after these 3 difficult years.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, there always has to be reflection. I mean, the military is an organization, as you well know, that assesses everything we do. So every time you go out on a mission, you come back and you reassess whether you did that mission correctly. And so, I guarantee you, Mark Milley, and I know we had a discussion earlier about Mark Milley, I will just tell you that General Mark Milley, one of the finest officers I ever served with and a very good friend. And he's in a very challenging position right now. I thought his letter to the troops yesterday was spot on. And I am not concerned, honestly, about the future of the military, because, again, the military believes in following the Constitution. That is what we swore an oath to. But we will constantly reassess. This is part of the process, and I know General Milley and the service chiefs, the combatant commanders, and all the rank and file every single day will look at issues like, how are we doing with race relations? How are we doing with gender relations? I mean, this is a constant part of what we do in the military.
Admiral, so many people speak of the greatest generation. I'm just curious. I had the honor of meeting you years ago when you were out training SEALs. And I'm just curious, as we talk about the greatest generation looking back, talk about the men and women that you have trained through the years, that you've served with, and that you have led into battle, just how extraordinary they have been in this generation.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I've said for years that I'm probably the biggest fan of the millennials you'll ever meet. And I always laugh at this narrative that somehow these millennials are soft, entitled little snowflakes. Then I'm quick to point out that you've never seen them in a firefight in Afghanistan. And so when we start to lose a little bit of hope about the country, I think all we have to do is look to this generation. And again, Reverend Al's remarks about the group of people that are marching peacefully. They are of all color, all gender, all races, all ethnicity. This is a remarkable generation. They will be this century's greatest generation. And so as troubling and as trying as these times are, I'm confident we'll get through it, because the young men and women today understand, again, what their parents and grandparents have gone through. They understand that they now own the mantle of this country, and I think they're going to do a great job taking us forward.
All right. Retired Admiral William McRaven, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your example and your leadership. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.